The Killing Sea, Chapter 26. Sarah stared at the bright lights in the rearview mirror and then looked at Ruslan. He appeared calm, as though he had all the time in the world to make a decision. His cheek, she noticed, was bruised. He revved the engine and popped the clutch. The truck shot forward and accelerated into the mud. Over the engine and splattering of mud, she could hear gunshots. The passenger side view mirror shattered and shards of glass peppering her in the face. The truck started sliding and slipping. Ayo, 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 Ruslan chanted. She joined in, changing the words of an old childhood story. I know you can, I know you can, I know you can. But maybe the truck couldn't. It slowed and sank deeper. God, how deep was the swamp? What if it swallowed them up? Should she get Peter to the roof of the cab? The wheels gripped hard again, and the truck lumbered out of the mud. Several more gunshots rang out. A hole appeared neat as a magic trick in the windshield. Ruslan grabbed Sarah's head and shoved her to the seat over. She jerked upright and gave him a glare. Don't do that again. Not safe. You don't have to shove me. Just tell me. She could see his bruised cheek tighten. Will you get down, please? Then she realized how dumb she was. People were shooting at them. She bent tight over Peter, who in turn held Surf Cat in his arms. The truck swayed and lurched as Ruslan steered around the obstacles and sometimes over them. Several minutes later, he said, We're okay now. We can't go anymore. We'll have to walk the rest of the way. She sat up. Downed oil palms blocked the road ahead, with no way around for the truck. In the distance, a small fire burned on top of a hillock they had camped on. Ruslan pulled some wires and the engine quit with one final shudder. The night's cool silence filled the cab. The only noise was Peter's raspy breathing. Sorry I snapped at you, Sarah said. I wasn't thinking. My dad sometimes says that if anyone tapped me on the head, my brain would pop out my... She caught herself. She could feel her coloring. You're a pantat? Ruslan said. Sarah chuckled. Is that how you say it? Ruslan grinned and then winced, pressing his fingers to his cheek. She reached up and took his hand away and touched her own fingers to the bruise. Does that hurt bad? Not so bad. On the seat between them, Peter coughed and said, You guys gonna yak all night? I don't feel so good. I want to sleep. They got out of the cab and started to hike. Sarah and Ruslan took turns carrying him, although Ruslan carried him the longest and furthest. Sarah was grateful for that. The eastern sky was already graying with light when they came to the hillock. Two young men had spotted them and were waiting. They spoke briefly with Ruslan in the local language and shyly but curiously shook hands with Sarah. Your family? Sarah asked Ruslan. Not yet. One of the men took Peter, swinging him onto his back for a piggyback ride. They started to walk again. The gray light strengthened. By the time the top of the sun had cracked the horizon, they'd come to the first of the green rice fields. Here was life as it had been, before the world had tilted. A jeep was parked on a badly potholed road, but otherwise ordinary road, clear of any flood and debris. From a stand of the trees by the road appeared another group of 3 men armed with rifles. The man who led them had an eye that was an ugly swirl of white. My uncle, Ruslan murmured to Sarah. With his good eye, Ruslan's uncle gave Sarah an assessing look that was neither unfriendly nor welcoming, and then hugged Ruslan. Ruslan, Sarah noticed, did not return the embrace. His uncle pointed to the bruise on his cheek. Ruslan gestured impatiently at that, and then spoke softly and swiftly. Papa, Sarah heard him say. Malabo. He nodded at Sarah. His hands mimed what his words were saying, his father pedaling a water park boat. His uncle's good eyes widened in astonishment. He turned to Sarah. Yes, he said in English. Yes, Sarah said. She felt jittery with impatience. She needed to get Peter to Malabo Hospital. The man lifted his chin and roared with laughter. He thinks it's funny, my father on a child's toy, Ruslan muttered to Sarah. But when the man's amusement died, he lifted his hands and said a prayer that was clearly one of thanksgiving. Ruslan nodded at Peter, still on the young man's back, and said a few urgent words. The uncle listened, a frown of concern gathering on his face. He felt Peter's neck and then barked an order at the young man who put Peter down in the back seat of the jeep. Ruslan turned to Sarah. He'll take us as far as he can. Sarah wanted to fly to Malabo's hospital, wanted to be there now. They all jammed into the boxy little car, Sarah rigid between Ruslan and the door, with Peter stretched out on their laps and Surf Cat on the floor mat between her feet. Ruslan leaned forward and gave his uncle a gold ring, saying something about it. The uncle read the inscription on the band and then nodded and put it in his shirt pocket. What was that all about? But Sarah was too tired to ask. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. When she woke, she found her head on Ruslan's shoulder. She straightened and drowsily watched a village of houses on stilts flash past. A mosque, crowded with people. Refugees, Ruslan said. Sarah closed her eyes again, determined to remain upright. But Ruslan's shoulder was irresistible. She gave up and leaned against him, snuggling to find the most comfortable position. When she woke next, his head was leaning against hers, his breathing a light snore. She extricated herself and adjusted Peter's weight on her lap. Her heart jolted when she noticed that the tips of his fingers were getting bluish tinge. God, couldn't they go any faster? The jeep turned down into the ruined coast, the driver making his way through a road that a handful of men were clearing. He stopped by the edge of a river, a remnant of a bridge still spanning it. They all got out, the driver taking Peter off Sarah's lap. Ruslan's uncle said something to Ruslan, pointing to tin roofs glinting in a valley on the other side of the river. With a stick he drew a map in the dirt, which Ruslan studied. Relief aid helicopters are beginning to make food drops at this village, Ruslan said to Sarah. We go and wait for one. How do we cross the river? That. Ruslan nodded at the narrow metal span. Sarah moaned, I can't. I'm afraid of heights. I did it before. It's easy. Don't worry. Using a big duffel bag from the back of the jeep, the men fashioned a secure sling for Peter. The two young men would take him across. Ruslan's uncle shook hands with Sarah, saying good luck in English. He hugged Ruslan again. This time Ruslan returned the hug with a smile that slowly became bemusement as he walked and Sarah walked to the bridge's embankment. I have family now, he said with wonder. Sarah scarcely heard him. That tiny little span 50 feet above the water consumed her attention. The men carrying Peter stepped confidently onto the metal I-beam, Surfcat trotting behind them. They were already halfway across when Ruslan finally badgered Sarah into taking her first step onto the girder right behind him. She gripped a guy wire with one hand, her other hand holding onto Ruslan's. She took a second step, a third. Now she had to get to the guy wire and take several steps to the second wire. All the space around her and the long drop below into the muddy water made her freeze up. She clung to the guy wire, moaning, I can't. You have to, Ruslan said, his tone now frustrated and angry with her. She squeezed her eyes shut. Please, Dad, help me. Her father was silent. Peter is waiting, Ruslan said in a softer voice. Think of Peter. Peter needed her. She had to cross the bridge for her brother. And so she did. One nervous step at a time, not daring to hold on to a guy wire for too long in case she couldn't let go again. When she at last jumped off onto solid ground on the other side, Ruslan said, Now that was easy, wasn't it? She looked back and shivered. No, it wasn't. I don't ever want to do that again. A man rode into view on a yellow trail bike and swung off to give it to Ruslan. Ruslan laughed in what sounded like disbelief. Our new ride, he said. We're going on that? It's okay, I've driven this before. I'm an expert at this trail bike. Ruslan tucked Surfcat between his legs. Sarah swung onto the saddle seat behind him. The two young men helped sandwich Peter between Ruslan and Sarah. Drive fast, she told Ruslan. He drove fast. At first she gingerly clasped his waist, but after one sharp turn she decided it was safer for her and Peter to wrap her arms around him. She leaned her head against his back. It felt safe, secure. Soon they came to a small village, its mosque crowded with refugees. Across the road from the mosque was a weedy soccer field with a big H painted on the center line. That must be the helicopter landing, Ruslan said over his shoulder. We'll wait at the mosque. He parked the trail bike outside the mosque's gate and lowered Surfcat to the ground. Sarah carried Peter to the shade of a wide veranda. Squatting on the tilted steps were a dozen or so dirty and ragged men with blackened skin of fishermen, their unblinking eyes staring at nothing. Sarah sat to their side with Peter's head resting on her lap. His breaths came shorter and harder as his fingertips were a touch bluer. When will the helicopter come? She asked Ruslan. I'll ask. He approached one of the villagers helping at the mosque and returned with the answer. Soon, he said. Soon could be forever. Sarah stroked Peter's head as she searched the sky, fiercely willing the helicopter to appear. One of the young fishermen stirred and rose from his haunches. A fire burned beneath his skeletal face. He asked Sarah a question in a tentative voice, as though he had to search for words. Ruslan says, he says can you help him? The man continued speaking, words coming faster now. Ruslan translated. His whole village is all gone from the tsunami, more than 200 people, only 16 men alive, women and children and elders gone. They saw the wave, but only the young men could run fast enough. This man tried to help his wife and baby, but they were too slow, and he had to leave them behind to save his own life. Ruslan blinked rapidly, and his voice trembled, but he finished the translation. He hasn't slept since. He asks, can you help him sleep? The man was looking at Sarah, but his gaze was so haunted that she wondered if he was really seeing her. She lifted her hand from her brother's head to reach out and touch him. I'm so sorry. I wish I had something. His smile was nothing, just a reflex, and he retreated to his silent, sleepless world. Sarah resumed her anxious scrutiny of the sky. A minute later, she heard the faint whop, whop, whop of several helicopters before she saw them, 3 dots against the clouds. 2 helicopters raced overhead, but one curved in a sharp descent to the soccer field. Village children pranced with excitement on the sideline. Let's go, she said. Ruslan took Peter in his arms, and they hurried out to the field. The helicopter was a military one with a painted flag on its side that Sarah didn't recognize. It settled delicately onto the grass with a great billowing wind. The roar roaring blades slowed but kept spinning on two helmeted men in green uniforms jumped out and began to manhandle boxes of noodles and bags of rice out of the chopper's belly. Sarah ran out to them, Ruslan right behind her, cradling Peter. One of the men, a handsome Indian, looked at her with mild surprise. She leaned close to his head and shouted as loudly as she could, "Can you give us a ride to Malabo?" The man spoke into his helmet microphone. The pilot looked through his cockpit window and waved them aboard. The crewman strapped the three of them into a row of aluminum and vinyl seats in the back of the helicopter and gave them earmuffs to wear against the noise. The chopper took off. The door had been removed, and through the open space, Sarah saw upturned faces of waving children and dwindling blobs. The rice paddies became patterns of geometry. Then, without warning, the green land turned brown and shattered, and trees and brushes all flattened in one direction, away from the coast. Sarah craned her head and saw the shore in the distance. Ruslan wasn't watching. He'd spotted a notebook and pen in his side pouch and was sketching his father's face again. Then she remembered. Surf Cat! They left Surf Cat behind. Peter leaned against her, his eyes half-lidded, his chest heaving with the effort of his breathing, and she forgot all about Surf Cat. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," she shouted at the pilot, but of course he couldn't hear her. The helicopter swung over a warren of undamaged houses and descended to a big field surrounded on three sides by military-looking barracks. People busted about, soldiers of various countries in various uniforms, as well as other Westerners and Asians. A red-haired woman in a skirt and blouse held a microphone to one of the Western military men in tan fatigues. Filming them with a shoulder video camera was a man in a scruffy goatee. None of it made any sense to Sarah. It all seemed so utterly surreal. The chopper's skids settled on the ground. Sarah yanked off her and Peter's earmuffs and seatbelts and bolted out of the helicopter with Peter in her arms, even before the crewmen were out of their seats. Ruslan was right behind her. "Where's the hospital?" She shouted at Ruslan over the dying roar of the engine. "This is military headquarters," he shouted back. "We need a car, too far to walk. We can try to find one on the main road." Still carrying Peter, Sarah ran to the side of the field. The red-haired woman looked at her and then abruptly lowered her microphone from the soldier's mouth. She rushed over to Sarah, her skirt snapping against her legs. The cameraman scuttled after her. "Aren't you Sarah aren't Sarah Bedford, are you?" the woman asked. "And your brother Peter?" "I need to get him to a hospital quick," Sarah said. The woman took in Sarah's ragged appearance the way she held Peter. "You look perfect," the woman said. "And keep holding your brother just like that. Just perfect." She stood by Sarah's side, clutching her arm behind the elbow as though to keep her from fleeing. The cameraman aimed his lens at them. The woman said brightly, "I'm here at Malabo, West Aceh, with an exclusive interview with the missing Bedford children, whom I've just found. Sarah, the whole world has been wondering what has happened to you and your brother. Would you like to fill us in?" "He's sick," Sarah said. "I need to get him to a hospital. Do you have a car?" "Tell us the events of December 26th, when you and your family were caught by the tsunami. You were on your yacht sailing to Malaysia, is that correct?" By this time, many of the busy people rushing back and forth around the barracks had paused to watch them. A man peeked out of the louved windows in the nearest building and a moment later darted around the corner, the sharp creases of his khaki safari suit slicing the air, with his cameraman on his heels. The woman lowered her microphone to snap, "George, this is my exclusive." The man ignored her and stood on Sarah's other side in front of Ruslan, facing his camera. He said, "In another amazing development, we have managed to locate Sarah and Peter Bedford." "Piss off, George," the woman said. "I was the one who found them first." He shoved his microphone into Sarah's face. "Sarah, what's your story? Where were you and your family when the tsunami hit?" "I need a ride to the hospital," Sarah pleaded. "Please, a car. Does anybody have a car?" More journalists and cameramen came running across the soccer field, one guy staggering along with a satellite dish. They surrounded Sarah and Peter, pushing and shoving for the best positions. The red-headed woman wielded her elbow like a weapon, but to little effect. A swarm of microphones circled Sarah's head. A dozen simultaneous questions in various English accents peppered the air, a bombardment of voices that confused and frightened her. Peter's arm slid off her neck. She struggled to hold his weight as she sucked air with jerky gasps. His lips were blue. "For God's sake, everybody!" Sarah shouted. "I need to get my brother to a hospital!" A woman thrust her microphone at Peter to capture his tortured breaths. The cameraman moved in for a close-up of Peter's face, his eyes fluttering. Other cameras jostled for position. "Somebody help me!" Sarah screamed. A tall Western soldier whom the women had interviewed pushed through the crowd, his cap bobbing above the others' heads. In her frightened confusion, Sarah thought he was going to add to the chaos, but then she noticed the black-lettered tags on his khaki tunic. His name was Herzig, and he was a U.S. Marine. She had no idea why a U.S. Marine would be there, yet here he was, as big as life. "Help me," she begged. "My brother swallowed a lot of dirty water." He took one sharp look at Peter and bellowed at someone across the soccer field. "Crossley, get the corpseman over here with the oxygen, on the double!" Taking Peter from her arms, he bullied his way through the journalists. Other Marines ran across the field, carrying a stretcher and medical kits. They transferred Peter to the stretcher. One corpseman slapped an oxygen mask onto his face as they rushed him into the shade of a tree. They knelt around him and treated him with swift but calm movements, putting a tube down his mouth, sticking needles into his arm. Sarah held her brother's limp hand. His blue fingertips flushed to red, the color of a miracle, and she felt like weeping with relief. The Marine named Herzig, clearly an officer of some kind, ordered another Marine with a radio pack to call the ship for an urgent medevac for the Bedford children and to pass the word on to the captain. The journalist circled the stretcher. The woman journalist knelt beside Sarah and murmured in her ear, "We'll give you $10,000 for an exclusive interview." George said in her other ear, "We'll double whatever she offered." She could have punched both of them. She shouted, "Will you please leave us alone?" Officer Herzig spread his long arms and said, "You heard her, everyone. Back off now." Another military helicopter shot onto the soccer field. "That's us," Officer Herzig said to Sarah. "We'll take you and your brother out to the ship. He'll get as good medical care there as anywhere." "Do you know where my dad is?" Officer Herzig shook his head. "There's been no word on him." "We were on Tiger Island. My mom's dead. He had a broken leg. We need to look for him." Officer Herzig nodded calmly. "We can best organize the search from the ship." The corpsman carried Peter to the helicopter where a doctor was waiting. Sarah searched the crowd and spotted Ruslan to the side, watching her, the notebook curled in his hand. She ran over to him. She wanted to give him a hug, but everyone was looking on, with many of the journalists still aiming their cameras at her. "Thanks so much, Ruslan," she said, trying to put into her voice more than just what the words themselves could carry. He gave her a small smile that slid into her heart like a drug. One of the helicopter's crewmen tugged at her elbow. "I'll be back to meet your father," she said, and gave him a final wave before boarding. As the helicopter lifted from the ground, Sarah peered out the window. She spotted Ruslan on the road below, showing the sketch of the notebook to the driver of a truck draped with a huge International Red Cross banner. She sat back, the lingering warmth of Ruslan's smile, the tremendous relief of having Peter safe giving way to a news urgency. She had her own dad to find.